Hello and welcome to Upper Pen. My name is Dakota, and today I'm talking with Jeffrey Engels, translator of Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again by Shigeru Kayama. Okay.
Shigeru Kayama.
Shigeru Kayama. Okay.
Well
I
done.
will invariably mispronounce it, so, you know, just ignore my bad pronunciation.
No worries.
So tell me about Kayama's books, the two of them.
Yeah. Great. First of all, Dakota, thank you for allowing me to come here and talk to you today. This is really a delight. I'm happy to have people tune in here in my study where I translated the book. So yeah, just a few words about the book itself. Um, Shigeru Kayama was the gentleman who wrote the very first draft of the screenplay of the very first Godzilla movie, the movie Gojira, or Godzilla, as it's known in English, which came out in theaters in the year 1954. So that movie was such a big success and a huge cinematic phenomenon, as I think many of us all know. Um, that there was quickly a sequel made by Toho Studios in 1955. And so, right about the same time that the movie was coming out, Kayama sat down and he wrote a novelistic treatment of these two stories. And so, the book that I translated postdates the films just slightly. But one of the reasons I think this book is so interesting is because it was actually written by the same guy who did the screenplays, and at the time in 1954, when movies were made in Japan, movies were really a very collaborative venture. I suppose they still are, right? You've got screenwriters working on it. You've got, actors saying things about the lines. You've got the director kind of changing things all the time. So the 1954 movie that came out, there was a lot of things that got changed from the screenplay that Kayama originally wrote. And so one of the reasons I think this book is so valuable is that it kind of gives us insight into what one of the original creators of Godzilla, and arguably the father of Godzilla, wanted to do with his story. And so we see that in this novel version of it, kind of away from all the forces at the studio that wanted to kind of put their finger into it and make it theirs. So
There
that's what,
is
what the book is.
what?
So that's what the book is.
So when I was reading it, I was struck at the very first chapter because it seems very much like the movie, right? So it's like the same pace, the same scenes. And
Mhm.
then there's a pretty good distinction between Godzilla in the movie and then Godzilla in the books.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
that's the like differences that the studio and the author were doing, right? Like this transition.
Yeah, so there definitely are some differences. Uh, for the most part, I would say the overwhelming contour of the story tends to
Yeah.
follow what happens in the movies fairly well. And I think probably audiences would have rebelled if he had written something that was too radically different, if it was way off the deep end. Um, but yeah, I think there's some subtleties that are really interesting for hardcore Godzilla lovers. It is really interesting to see some of the variations in the story. One of the very first things that might strike readers when they open up the book is that there's this introductory passage which comes directly from Kayama himself, in which he speaks to the readers and says, I'm writing this story because I wanted to protest the proliferation of atomic and hydrogen weapons in the world. And he was living under the Cold War regime, where the U.S. and the Soviet Union were just building up more and more and more bombs. And he really reminds us very strongly right here on the very first page that Godzilla is, in his mind, kind of a stand-in for the fear of atomic and hydrogen bombs that are hanging over Japan's head. Japan felt very caught in the middle of the Cold War experience, And because of Japan's own experience with atomic weaponry in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then again in another incident that happened in early 1954, that I'm happy to talk about here in a second. The like Japan really felt like it was caught, and there was this threat hanging over its head. So he kind of gave that threat a form in Godzilla, this monstrous form that would just randomly come trampling across Japan and destroying things. So
Yeah.
anyway,
So yeah, go ahead.
yeah, yeah. So Kayama really felt himself, very strongly part of the anti-nuclear movement. And he writes, in the beginning of his introduction, as one small member of that movement, I've tried to do my part by writing a novel, the tale that you now hold in your hands. Reading this book in that context will make it all the more informative and interesting. So like, there's one place like where Kayama has really kind of asserted a strong message that, is a little bit watered down in the film. It's not super, super explicit. I mean, it's there, but he doesn't actually kind of come out and say it so directly in the film.
Yeah, it's so if you don't know the history of Godzilla and you're watching it for the first time today, it's very much like, oh, this is just a cool creature feature from Japan. Um,
Right.
and that like modeled skin of Godzilla and the atomic breath, those things might
Mhm.
go over your head as like, I don't know what those are.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, definitely. So in 1954, the fear of radiation was at an all-time height in Japan. And, it didn't have to do just with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which had taken place 9 years before in 1945. In the year 1954, early in the year, there happened to be a boat filled with Japanese fishermen that was, swimming out there in the South Pacific. It was going along just outside of the Marshall Islands, near a place called Bikini Atoll, when the U.S. happened to be secretly testing hydrogen bombs there, bombs that were many, 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 many times stronger than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these poor fishermen just happened, by bad luck, to get caught in the blast. Ironically, the name of their boat was the Lucky Dragon Number Five, Daigo Fukuryumaru. So an ironically named boat. He was tremendously unlucky. So these people were caught in the radioactive blast of the Castle Bravo test by the U.S. military. Within the space of a year, one of the crew members died of acute radiation sickness, and the others all became tremendously ill. So this was front page news in Japan. First of all, because those hydrogen bomb tests were secret, and and Japan was horrified to learn that these enormous, enormous tests were going on, you know, within a distance to Japan that was close enough that there might be Japanese fishing boats in the area. It caused a mass panic across Japan. There was, in the subsequent investigation that was held by the government, they discovered that the fish that had been brought back by the fishing vessel were all radioactive, not surprisingly. And they found out that other fish that were reaching the Japanese markets and reaching Japanese tummies were also radioactive, presumably from the blasts, from other blasts. And this 1954 was a year in which all of Japan was up in arms and furious about this situation, panicked about their food supplies. So the director of the producer, the gentleman who originally came up with the concept for the movie Godzilla, he was operating like in the environment very soon after this poor fishing vessel got irradiated. So that was already front page news. And he found himself in, for long, complicated reasons, he found himself without a screenplay for that year. And his previous project had fallen through. And so he was like, oh my God, I've got to write something, I'm going to come up with something really fast. He was on an airplane. He picked up a trade magazine, which had an article about the American film, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. And he was like, I wonder if we could make a big monster movie in Japan. And ooh, radiation, since radiation is front page news in Japan right now, maybe we could use that in the plot. So that's kind of the backgrounds for this. That producer then took the plan to the studios. The studio then put it back in the hands of the producer. Then producer hired Kayama, this gentleman who wrote the work that I've translated.
Wow. So this happened quickly.
Very quickly. Right, right. They hired Kayama to write the first draft of the screenplay in May of 1954. And then very quickly, they did all of the filming, all of the special effects, all the stuff. And the movie was in theaters by November of that same year. So an incredible turnaround, like basically about a half a year. Um, Unthinkable, like
Yeah.
especially when you consider that, like, what an iconic uh monster, Godzilla became. He's a name that everyone everywhere around the world knows. And yeah, just an incredible turnaround for such an important film.
And then the book too. The book came out immediately. So
Right. Yeah. So the book came along in 1955, just a couple of months, I forget exactly, maybe 3 months after the film was released. So the second film, I should say, the sequel. So yeah, I mean, really, again, this all happened within a very, very short span of time.
listen, I've never done anything that quickly.
Yeah, I think my translation took longer than that.
So that brings up, how did you get assigned to translate, or did you petition to translate?
I did. Uh, uh, to go back a couple of steps and sort of tell the story from the beginning, I was in Japan during the 2011 disasters. The earthquake was the most frightening thing I've ever experienced in my life. It was just completely terrifying once the Fukushima meltdown began to take place. And none of us knew what was going to happen in Japan. All of Japan was glued to the television trying to figure out what was happening next. And so, I really walked away from that experience, that time in Japan, deeply frightened by radiation in a very visceral way that I'd never been before. Of course, I knew about radiation. I grew up during the Cold War. This is a time when we were taught to, like, duck under our desks if there was a nuclear blast, as if that would do anything. you
Super
know
helpful.
but yeah. But I came back to America, and like, I was thinking about the disasters all the time, and I felt very deeply concerned about Japan, this country where I spent a big part of my life, and a place that I love so much. So in my courses, back at Western Michigan University, where I teach, I started teaching classes about disaster in modern Japan. And in the course of doing that, I decided to stick Godzilla into the syllabus because, I thought, well, this is at least a fun break. We're reading all these things about disasters, all the sad stuff about people dying. And, I thought, well, Godzilla, yes, people die, but at least it's kind of of a different tone, I think, than some of the other things. So, in the course of showing Godzilla a couple of times to my class, I started paying attention to lots of details that I hadn't necessarily paid a lot of attention to in the first run through. Um, and, I'd seen this movie, first time decades ago. But I noticed that, like, in the credits there at the very beginning, it would say, Gensaku Kayama Shigeru, like based on the work of Shigeru Kayama. And I was like, based on the work of Shigeru Kayama. And I recognize his name as a famous mid-century science fiction author from Japan. And I was like, well, what is his involvement? I'd read a little bit of this scholarship about Godzilla, but hardly there was any mention of his name at all. So I got interested. I started investigating. Uh, I got very quickly the Japanese paperback version of Godzilla, which is
So
right
awesome.
here. Yeah, and it's this is so commonly available. It's on like every, major bookstores, bookshelf. So this is a book that's really not unknown in Japan. But much to my surprise, no one had really ever paid any attention to it here. A lot of people have paid attention, obviously, to Godzilla as a film, as a really important film. There's lots of film historians who have looked at it in incredible detail. So I was stunned to realize that there was this book out there that, yes, people have been reading in Japan for a long time and people knew about, but somehow that had been left out of the entire story here. So I wrote to the publisher of this book and I said, "Hey, I'm really interested in this." I learned that a French translation had come out, and that an Italian translation had also come out. So I'm like, well, If the wheels are already in motion in other countries, it's we should make sure that there's one in English too. So I wrote, and we got the permissions, and then I sent it off to University of Minnesota Press. The reason for doing that was because University of Minnesota Press has been doing in recent years some really wonderful translations of important Japanese science fiction writers. And so knowing that, I'm like, hey, here's a science fiction book that some of your readers might have heard of. And very quickly, the press said yes. And so I was really incredibly thrilled with it. The cover, which you can see back there on that awesome poster, da, 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 it's so handsome. I just love the treatment that University of Minnesota Press gave to the book. I couldn't be happier with how it turned out.
I love that it looks like classic Japanese art. And I was like, is this a poster somewhere that I don't have? What are we doing?
Yeah, I was completely stunned when I saw the cover because it's just so great, and it looks very vintage.
Yeah.
My understanding is that they used a company called iStock, which has lots of kind of images, including vintage ones, and they chose a vintage Godzilla comic, and the rest is history.
Wow, that is so awesome. So
Thank
you
you.
just wrote to this company and you're like, hey, I see you don't have an English translation. Did you have to provide credentials or anything?
I didn't. Well, I did in my letter. When I introduced myself, I said, I've done quite a lot of translations of Japanese literature along the way. I think this is my four, 13th or 14th book or something like that.
Okay.
I've lost track along the way, but yeah, and so I did introduce myself briefly. Hi, I'm a translator of Japanese literature. I've translated several of these books before. Some of my works have won prizes and for translation. Um, and I also provided, along with the that letter, a sample. I did a sample to show that I was serious and that I understood the text well enough to do a translation. By
That's
the way,
fantastic.
I don't want to diss anyone, but when I was looking working on this, I did look at the French translation a couple of times where there are passages that I was kind of like, oh, what should I do? I can read French, and I think I spent more time working on it than maybe that other translator did.
Well,
Anyway,
translation is so very difficult because there are
it is.
concepts in Japan that just don't translate to English. So
That's
how do
right.
you
That's
deal
right.
with that?
Yeah. Unfortunately, in this book, there weren't a gigantic number of textual problems like that. A lot of the description in this book is fairly concrete. It's talking about who the characters are, what they did, what they said, what they looked like. Visuals of what was happening, and as Godzilla stomped on Tokyo. Um, but there are always some kind of textual issues that are really complicated. There were some references to songs. There was one passage in which a character makes a like a reference to a well-known passage that was on people's tongues in the 1950s, but none of my Japanese friends who I showed it to could recognize it off the top of their head. So there always are some sort of textual problems. And if I could just shift gears a little bit
Yeah,
and talk
go
about
ahead.
one of those textual problems, the most complicated problem for me in this text was how to deal with sound, because the book is extremely it's written for young audiences, and so there's a lot of visual description. This is happening, that's happening, this is happening, that's happening. But there's also a lot of sound in it. We hear, especially in the scenes where Godzilla is attacking, there's all kinds of bangs and crashes and kapows and the other Japanese equivalents of all those words. But Japanese is a language that has a very, very enormous sound-rich vocabulary. And there's so many words to refer to sounds that even for things that we wouldn't use a sound for in English. Like there's a passage that Kayama really likes, a phrase he really likes. He would say like, this character hatto this character did a ha, like, and ha is kind of the sound of like someone sort of like, like perking themselves up and paying attention or something like that. And so, or to maybe catch one's breath. So, so just like the one phrase there, hatto suru, to make a ha, sound. I probably translated maybe in like 10 different ways depending on context, like he stood up, he perked up, or he caught his attention or something like that. And sometimes those choices that I made, they convey the meaning, but they don't convey that specific sound, the kind of like the catching of the breath. And so I had that problem a lot of times where the text is extremely auditory. It's not just visual, it's very auditory. And I try to keep as much sound in there as possible because it's such a loud, clanging, clunking, banging, text filled with like sound that I wanted that in there. It's like one of the distinctive characteristics of the style, but that was challenging. I had to think about like I quickly began to run out of words to say bang in English.
You can't use it every page, so
Right. And yeah, and again, there's like so many of those different words. Another example that I sometimes use when talking about like the difficulties of translating this book is one Japanese onomatopoeia called meri meri. And like, so the text would say like the building crumbled up meri meri. And at first, it was kind of like I had a hard time envisioning what that meant. But meri meri in Japanese is like the sound of something like an accordion crumpling. It's like the sound of like the layers of something coming together. Like another place where you might use it is like the if a car crashes into something and the front of the car gets all smushed, you would say that the car crumpled up meri meri in Japanese. And because like buildings are crumpling in Tokyo all over this book, that's an onomatopoeia that appears a lot. But I still can't think of a really good English language equivalent of that crunch. I don't know, but yeah. So yeah, I had to think about onomatopoeias a lot, and so that was fun.
did you Americanize many of those so that it would be much more relatable?
I did, especially the sound words. I
Yeah.
did kind of I did Americanize them somewhat. And actually, probably the most clear example of that is Godzilla's roar. In the book, Godzilla, whenever he roars, it's represented phonetically, and his roar almost always sounds like "wah." And I mean, that sounds kind of roar-like, but I thought if I wrote GWAAAAAA on the page, like people wouldn't necessarily like equate that with a roar. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So so whenever I translated Godzilla's roar, I translated it with a slightly more roary sound, I guess. GGGRRRAWR, to kind of look like, um, so I did kind of Americanize that sound a little bit. And the reason that this is important is because in the second novella, Godzilla meets a foe, Anguirus, and this other big monster comes out of the sea and he fights with Godzilla. And he has a completely separate roar. And his roar is like in Japanese, it's written phonetically, it's whoa. And again, that doesn't look like it doesn't sound like a roar. So again, I had to kind of like figure out how to do that. But because they each had their distinctive roar, I had to keep them separate, but somehow make them sound like a roar at the same time. So
Did
yeah.
you have a lot of friends to bounce this off of? Like, can you make this roaring sound, please, so I can hear it?
I didn't, because the roar was written out phonetically. It was, I read it and I was like, okay, I can hear the sound of my imagination, but yeah, yeah. People who love the Godzilla movies know that each of the different monsters that appears in the Godzilla movies has their own distinctive roar.
Yeah.
And amongst Godzilla fans, like, those are kind of like calling cards for the different monsters. People, imitate the roar of their favorite monster, and people have great fun with that sort of thing. So I felt like I couldn't just collapse this all into a simple roar in English. That'd be so boring. Who wants that?
Well, also Godzilla's roar is very much more like wind-like and like
Mm,
it has like that gushing sound, right? Like,
uh-huh. Uh-huh.
yeah. So it doesn't
Yeah.
sound like a normal roar.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. My understanding is that the sound for the roar in the film, in the 1954 film, was invented by the composer of the soundtrack, a gentleman by the name of Akira Ifukube, who I think is a genius. He's one of my favorite composers. I'm really into classical music, and this guy is not listened to nearly enough outside of Japan. His music is so exciting. I can't say enough wonderful things about him. But I'm getting off the track. But my understanding is that he was like kind of fooling around in the studio one day, and he told a double bass player to kind of like do something funny on the strings, and that's how we got the sound for his roar in the film. They kind of distorted the sound of a double bass um, in order to get that very iconic sound. But in the book, Kayama wasn't able to reproduce that very iconic sound on the page very well. So I think he just went with wow.
Well, that's okay. It's fine.
Yeah, we like it.
One of the other things that I noticed is that in the very beginning, in I believe it's a note from you, there's
Uh-huh.
an explanation about why the names are in the American order.
Yeah, yeah.
So that was
Um, s-
odd.
yeah, so that was a little bit of a surprise for us. And at University of Minnesota Press, their policy is to put Japanese names in the Japanese order. And that's an increasingly common trend in the United States. Until fairly recently, Japanese names were put in the English order, but in recent years, other Asian countries have been going with like Chinese names have been going with the Chinese order. Like for instance, the founder of modern China is all known to us as Mao Zedong, and we don't that's his name in the Chinese order. We don't reverse it. But Japan has had, in its long history with the West, for many years, they were reversing Japanese names and trying to put them in an order that American readers would understand, and putting the family name at the end,
Yeah.
where last name. But in Japanese, actually, the family name comes first. So so when we so anyway, the point is that University of Minnesota Press, their policy was to put Japanese names in the Japanese order. But I think that Japan hasn't necessarily, not everyone in Japan has caught up with that yet. So when we wrote and we got the rights to it, one of the things in the contract was specifically they said in this book we want you to put the name in the English order to avoid confusion over last name and first name. And so we were a little bit surprised by that because it goes against what Minnesota has been doing in recent years. But of course, we're happy to go along with that. I had originally done the book, the whole thing with the all the names in the Japanese order, so I had to go back and I had to reverse everyone and make sure that they're all consistent to keep up with the copyright holders' wishes. But I'm totally happy with that. And in fact, most other English language scholarship about Godzilla and the films, they put the names in the English language order. So people who are used to reading about the Godzilla movies from other texts or whatever, they're not going to be surprised by the order of the names in this book.
Maybe that's the reason, just consistency throughout the scholarship. It was just
Yeah,
odd. I was like, oh, but we have so much cultural um, influence from Japan right now in
right.
particular. And I was like, oh, that's just
Yeah,
odd.
yeah.
But
Well, yeah, I think it's interesting because I think people who are interested in Japan and know about Japan recognize that family names in Japan come first, and
yeah,
then the given name. So in Japanese, the author's name would be Kayama Shigeru, but yeah. Um, but maybe not everyone knows that yet. So anyway, but we have on the side of the book the name Kayama just here, so to
okay.
clarify, in case anyone has a question.
Did you refer to most of the characters by their family name then originally?
So I try to follow what was in the text. So
Okay.
if a character like for instance, there's two characters who are in the same family. There's a professor who is an expert in paleontology, and his name in Japanese is Yamane. That's his family name, Yamane Kyohei. And in English, I put it as Kyohei Yamane um, for consistency throughout the book with, you know, family name at the end. But then he also has a daughter whose name is Emiko. And so, like, for instance, the text will refer to her as Emiko, to the dad as the professor or Professor Yamane, just to keep those two characters separate. So I kind of followed the conventions that were there in the book. Another one of the main characters is a young guy by the name of Shinkichi, who kind of is one of the main characters throughout the book. And Shinkichi is a given name, not a family name, not a
Okay.
surname. So throughout the book, he's just referred to as Shinkichi or the youth or something like that. Yeah.
I love like literature from the 50s and 60s where they refer to you by your title or your like
Ah.
station in life. I don't know. It seems quaint.
Yeah, yeah. And actually that's relatively common in Japanese literature that people will say, they'll use the word sensei, which means
Yeah.
like teacher or professor, and very, very frequently, the paleontologist character in the original Japanese is just referred to as sensei, sensei, sensei. Um, Sometimes I would translate that as professor, but sometimes I would, include the name Professor Yamane if I thought it was, help somehow. Yeah.
Do you feel like you can do, I don't know where that, how to phrase it. So how do you think this book will impact the research and literature of Godzilla?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm hoping that, first of all, that it becomes better known that this important science fiction writer was a part of Godzilla right at the very beginning. He's not well known outside of Japan, and to the best of my knowledge, this is the first ever official translation of anything that he did. But he was every young person who loved science fiction in the mid part of 20th century knew his name. So I definitely want to. I mean, one goal of this whole project is to kind of connect him to this entire story because I think it's a crime that he's been left out of all the scholarship until now. Um, I also think that like by kind of like putting him in the spotlight a little bit, that it becomes a little bit easier to kind of connect Godzilla to what came before and after too. Like Kayama is a really interesting guy. He was born in what was it, 1904, and he spent the years of World War II working at the Japanese Ministry of Finance. He was kind of a business guy. He dropped out of college, but he got this job in the government and worked through the difficult years of World War II. But he grew up reading all this kind of pulpy fiction that was being produced in the 1920s and 1930s, which was like an amazing time in Japan. It was filled with like really exciting writers who were doing all kinds of daring stuff that had never been done before. And so he grew up like just like feeding upon all this literature, taking it all in. And especially the kind of adventure stories, stories of the weird, stories of the grotesque and the bizarre, which are very popular in the 1930s, like in pulpy magazines and stuff. And so he during World War II, he didn't write anything. He made his debut a couple of years. Actually, he did make a debut in 1940. He published some poems, but he published his first prose in 1947. So, and World War II ended in 1945. So, and where he made his debut was in a magazine called Hoseki, which is usually translated as the Jewel, and it was run by one of the major science fiction mystery writers, authors that he loved so much when he was, writing in the reading in the pre-war years. Um, so like I think that there's this really interesting way in which like by thinking about him as a person, we're kind of like able to tie him into this much bigger current of Japanese literary history, which is so exciting. We don't have nearly enough translations of that stuff. There's quite a few of us in academia who are reading and passionately interested in this stuff, but there's not nearly enough translations to go along to kind of show us all these connections. And I definitely want to try to help make some of those connections by bringing this book out.
Are you going to do a short biography of him? Because that would be helpful.
In fact, I think I'd like to do a little bit more than that.
Okay.
I'm really curious. I'd like to try producing a collection of his short stories, some of his most famous short stories, because I think there's a lot of stuff in there that fans of Godzilla would like. Kayama loved to write stories. One of his favorite themes is about like animals and monsters, like little communities of creatures that are hidden away from the rest of the world and undiscovered until something happens and they become you know common knowledge. Like his very first story ever, published in 1947, he submitted to this magazine that I just mentioned, Hooseki, the Jewel. They were having a contest for new writers, and he won with a story which was about a kind of ape-like orangutan creature that was living out in the South Pacific, undiscovered until humans came along and were destroying its natural habitat. So it's a perfect kind of climate change sort of story. But also too, I mean, if you're familiar with the Godzilla universe, that's like basically the story of Godzilla. The Godzilla was this, like leftover from, ancient times, like living down there at the bottom of the ocean, minding his own business until, the military came along and woke him up with their hydrogen testing and got hydrogen bomb testing. Made him really angry, and that's why he stomps across Tokyo.
Do a lot
So
of his stories have an ecological aspect to them like that?
yeah, no, he's clearly very interested in science, and it seems like a lot of his reading is based in science somewhere. And so he does seem to have a kind of ecological mindset, and I think that that's one of the reasons that I'm attracted to him. We're living in a time of catastrophic ecological change, where we're realizing that everything, every little thing that we do, regardless of whether or not we thought it had any impact, does have an impact. And so, like, Godzilla, in a way, is a kind of like perfect fable for our moment in time. Right? I think Godzilla is like a wonderful, like, morality story for the Anthropocene, this geological time in which we live. And so, that's one of the things that kind of drew me to this story too. It's that it's this really interesting fable for our time in a way, and I see that in other works by Kayama as well.
I'm so
That's one of
upset
the
that,
reasons I'd like to bring him to American audiences.
yeah, I'm so upset that I never knew he existed. And like, I was like, this man sounds like he has a lot of really fantastic work, but why is it not in English? I can't learn
Right, I
Japanese in a few
know.
weeks.
I know. And it's I'm super excited that you're excited by it. Like I hope my infection for my love for this work is infectious. Um, but overall, there's a lot of books published in Japan every year, and so the Japanese publishing industry is enormous, and it has been for a very long time. The Japanese population is an extremely productive population when it comes to literature. There are about as many books published in Japan every year as there are in the United States, which is remarkable considering that Japan has about half the population, less than half the population of the United States. So the per capita production of literature is extremely high. However, there's only something like 30 books or so translated from Japanese into English every year in the field of literature. If we say, I'm setting aside manga here
Yeah.
because there's a lot of manga translation, but of like prose writing, prose and poetry in Japan, only about 30 books a year are published in North America. So it's a shockingly low number when you consider that tens of thousands of books are coming out all the time. So if my point is that if this is the field of Japanese literature right here, filling up the entire screen, we only get about this much in translation here, this little teeny itty bit. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I think that there's a lot of exciting writing out there that, if American readers had access to it, they would want. They would want. So there's a lot of work out there for translators to do. It's takes a long time. It takes a lot of specialized knowledge to be able to translate literature, but it's really fun. It's really fun, and I hope it's fun for readers too.
I'm sure people will wonder why you can't just have like AI translate it or Google Translate do these things, but it's complicated.
It is complicated, and I am heartened. I do feel like AI is coming a long ways. Like
Yeah.
I've seen machine translation come. an enormous distance in the last 10 years. It's like what the translations that are coming out now are so much better. But even so, there's something that's often very kind of wooden and stiff and not very natural about machine translation. It's usually a good first start. But I've also found, that when things get tricky, and that often happens in literature, some things machines will get it wrong very, very often. And yeah, that's something that we haven't kind of mastered yet. I think that literary translations, there's a lot of room left for people to do it.
Yeah.
A machine translation doesn't quite do it yet.
Well, I can't imagine so you have a science fiction writer with a completely original concept and an AI who is only able to translate the input that it's received. Like it won't, I don't think it'll capture the essence of those things, you know? So,
Right. And one of the things that I think that's so important and special about literature is the author's voice, right? I
yes.
mean, every author sounds different. And that's part of the joy of reading, that we fall under the spell of the patterns and the wordplay and the particular ways of seeing things of a particular writer, right? And
Yes.
so those are the kinds of things like recreating that spell, that kind of emotional spell, that kind of that emotional investment, that we as readers put into it is something really hard for an AI to do. It's just looking at words, it's just kind of finding correspondences and so on. But AI can't really, at least yet, kind of hear the tone of a text and sort of try to reproduce what that tone might be like in the second language.
Yeah. So I'm eternally grateful that you've done this and you
Oh, thank
have.
you. Thank you.
I was so excited and I can't wait to see what else you come out with, what translations or work you do next. So,
Oh, great. I have to say that this is a bit of a different venture for me. I've done a lot of translations of um, works that so one of my Japanese literature friends said, Jeffrey tends to specialize in work that's really, really hard to read. Like novels that are extremely complicated or poetry that's like really involved or whatever. And so this particular friend said to me, like, I can't believe that you're working on Godzilla. That seems like such a departure for you. And I'm like, well, no, 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 not really. It's like it has to tie in with my interest in these pre-war writers and the kind of over the flow of Japanese literary history, and once I explained it to them, they're all like, okay, okay, but isn't Godzilla easier to read? And I have to admit, it is a lot easier to read than some of this archaic stuff that I've been working on. But yeah, I mean, this is definitely it was so much fun working on this book, and I hope it comes through in the translation. That I really want to share more work of this kind of style. I want to share more of Kayama's work. Um, I've been talking with University of Minnesota Press about another book in the Godzilla universe. The book, the film Mothra is one of the few in the Godzilla universe series that the Godzilla franchise that was based on a book first. There was a book first, and it was called Hakko Yosei to Musra, the Luminous Fairies in Mothra, and then that was turned into the film that we all know. And so when I submitted this to the press and word came out that it was on the net that it was coming out, a couple of people wrote to the press and said, "Hey, we hope that you're going to do the Mothra book next." And the editor turned that around to me and said, "Hey, Jeffrey, some people want to do the Mothra book next. So what are you up to?" So we're in the process of looking into the rights right now, and if everything pans out, then who knows? That might be one of the future projects.
that is so exciting.
Thanks. Thanks. It's been really fun for me to realize how many people have like a Godzilla story. Everyone has a story about like the first time they encountered him, or the first time that they, felt some affection for like one of the Godzilla movies or something. And it's, for me, one of the fun things about doing this entire project has been the opportunity to just talk with people and hear about why this monster appeals to them and what it was about him.
It's not just that, it's how Japan told the stories too,
Mm,
which were
right.
so different than American movies. And I was
Yeah.
just like thrown.
Yeah, yeah. And as you pointed out earlier in our conversation, especially like the very, very first Godzilla movie, if people are only thinking about Godzilla as this kind of, silly
Yeah.
throwaway thing that kids watch, like, monster stomping on buildings. Yes, there is some aspect of a monster stomping on buildings, but it's a very deeply powerful, like mournful film. There's some really powerful scenes in there. And we have to remember that when the film first came to movie theaters, it appealed both to children and to adults equally. Like, adults saw like the scenes of the destruction of Tokyo and they remembered the fire bombings of Tokyo, which took place only like less than a decade before. The ruins in Tokyo had not completely disappeared, from at that point. So people were confronted every day by these reminders of the war. And so it's said that like a lot of people, adults who went to the theater and saw these scenes of Godzilla's rampage through Tokyo, burst into tears. Like it was a really cathartic thing for a lot of people. So, I mean, it's a really powerful movie. I think some of the sequels to Godzilla were lighter in tone and they were much more fun with monsters battling each other. But at least this first one that Kayama, was involved with and wrote for is a really profoundly beautiful movie that I think speaks to people of all ages.
I think Shin Godzilla kind of
Mm.
captured that essence as well. Not fully, but it did capture it. So
Yeah, 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 definitely. So for those listeners who might not be familiar with it, after the 2011 disasters in Japan and the meltdown at Fukushima, um, a couple years passed, and then a major Japanese motion picture company released a new Godzilla. Shin in Japanese means new, and Gojira means Godzilla. So it was called Shin Gojira, and it was released in this country, I think, with the title Shin Godzilla.
yes.
Um, so this is a movie which basically pretends like none of the other Godzilla movies had happened, and so this is like a new Godzilla rises out of the sea. No one knows where he's come from. They have to do the investigation and all that kind of stuff. But what they do is I mean, the creators of that movie have used that as an opportunity to kind of reflect upon Japan's very recent experience with disaster, its recent experience with the Fukushima meltdown. It reflects like some of the Japanese concerns about whether or not the Japanese bureaucracy was up to handling such a gigantic, catastrophic mess. There are scenes in the movie which are very powerful and very mournful. There are also scenes that are like almost perfectly reproduce things that actually happened in Japan at the time of the Fukushima meltdown. So, so yeah, that too was a very thoughtful movie and one that had, a big political purpose other than just, you know,
Yeah.
cool scenes with lots of CGI and, lots of destruction. Yeah.
The sounds that they included in that movie too were kind of
Mm.
haunting. That violin kind of distortion. Um,
Oh.
that was intense, and it made it all the more intense.
Wow. Wow.
So
Wow. I'm glad it spoke to you. Yeah, I when I saw it, I that was right as I was beginning to teach my classes on disaster, and I was already showing Godzilla to my students, and that came along, and I'm like, oh, now after we talk about the Fukushima meltdown, I've got to show that one too.
well,
So
clearly.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I sometimes, in fact, have my students write like a comparison paper, comparing the two films and talking about the messages in them. Yeah, because they're such a good pair.
Yeah, but they do focus dramatically on different things. Like Godzilla is
Yeah,
very much destruction and the consequences of that. And then there's Shin, which is bureaucracy not helping people.
right, right. In the very first Godzilla, the 1954 one, there are some scenes where, in early in the movie, where like the people who have witnessed the destruction of Godzilla appear in front of the Japanese Diet, which is like kind of the equivalent of Parliament, I guess. The Japanese legislative body, and they're talking about like what they've seen and so on. but we don't get into like and there is some discussion about like how the military is going to work together, and we find out that it doesn't work very well. But that's a kind of secondary aspect of the plot. But they've really picked that up and kind of made that into the very primary focus of Shin Godzilla, by making bureaucracy and this question of how do we work together to deal with catastrophes on such a huge scale. Like that's a really difficult thing for any kind of bureaucracy to handle. But that like issue is front and center in the film, the new film.
Yeah. It makes me wonder, like, if this is completely off topic.
Go ahead.
It makes me wonder if originally, because Japan had been demilitarized and kind of quasi taken over by the United States,
Mhm.
if they were trying to hold people together instead of picking apart their government. And now that they're
Mm.
in a more stable place, that they feel they can criticize the government and not,
Mm.
you know.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, so the Japanese government is big, and
Yeah.
right now, I spent a couple of years working in one small little branch of a local government, and even then, I was surprised at how big they were and how many people were doing interesting things there. But the size of a big government sometimes means that the right hand doesn't always know what the left hand is doing, and they're not always lockstep, in with one another. Um, and that's an issue. For the most of the time, it's not really much of an issue until everyone has to come together. Like in the case of a disaster,
Yes.
um, then who has the authority to issue orders? Um, and all of these questions became really prominent and salient in Japan after the Fukushima meltdown and after that huge destruction all up the northeastern Japanese coast in Tohoku. It was the tsunami that came ashore and washed hundreds of miles of coastline, just destroying villages. Around 20,000 people were lost, just in the tsunami. So, I mean, how do you deal with like the destruction of hundreds of miles of coastline? I mean, phew, it's a really difficult question.
Yeah.
So these are the kinds of things that were definitely on the minds of the filmmakers when they made that sequel.
Yes. Well, if anybody hasn't read yet Godzilla or Godzilla Raids Again, I think it's out October 3rd,
Mhm.
correct?
That's right. Yeah, that's the official release day. But I do hear rumors that copies are going out. So maybe you could get a copy even sooner than that if you wanted. Yeah.
That'd be exciting. Are you doing any
Yeah.
signings or anything?
Yeah. I've been invited a few places. I'm going to be going to a Comic-Con here very shortly, in Windsor, and I'm hoping to do some others over the course of the next year. But yeah, I'd love to get out there and meet some Godzilla fans and hear your Godzilla origin stories.
I'm sure you will find them. They will find you.
Right on.
Well, thank you so much, Jeffrey, for talking to me today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Dakota. Thank you so much.
And I honestly cannot recommend Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again more. Like, it's fantastic. If you loved the movies, any of them, you will love this book. Oh my God.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, thank you and have a great day.
All right. Thanks so much.